go
Yeah,
back to share.
Yeah, it's recording now.
Yeah. Okay, good. So now this is my practice. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to Dr. Sen and the esteemed panel. It's my pleasure to give you a short overview of my dissertation research today. I'd like to start with a short analogy. I'd like you to take a look at this cup. Imagine that this cup is the community, and like the community, the cup is actually broken. What happens when I pour water into my cup that's cracked? It starts to leak. Can the community use this water? No, of course not, because it's all leaked out. This is how chronic violence impacts communities. It appears as cracks. Think about your own communities. What type of cracks do you have? In my community here in Kenya, we have cracks from colonialism, corruption, winner-takes-all politics, bad governance, and we have issues of violence, from violent crime to violent extremism to also ethnic violence at our election times. In Kenya, donors have spent billions of dollars tending to our cracks. And yet after 15 years of living here in Kenya, to me, the cracks appeared bigger today than when I first came to Kenya, even with all this outside aid. Why is this? I believe it has to do with the deep intergenerational, cultural, social, and political traumas that come with our cracks. Trauma does not cause the cracks. Instead, violence, injustice, inequality have caused the cracks. But trauma has made our cracks almost impossible to fix. As Dr. Bethel says, we're living in a trauma-organized society. One thing that we know is that as outsiders, outsiders can't repair our cracks. Only we can repair our own cracks. And this is why healing our trauma is important and frankly a missing component of so many peace-building programs. But wait, the concept of trauma is from outsiders, predominantly Westerners. Many countries in the global South are skeptical as they've seen the fields of psychiatry and psychology neglect our local knowledge and practices, thus leading to misguided assumptions and problematic treatments, and even deeper cracks. The mainstream approaches that I'll talk about later in my presentation are the mental health approach, the psychosocial approach, and the other approach that is called the ignore it approach, where people ignore the issues and pretend that the issues just do not matter. Peace-building practitioners from conflict-affected areas have historically acknowledged social, political, and economic conditions, including colonialism and slavery, as taking center stage in the mental health issues and in our general well-being, also our peace-building issues. As a result, programs in the Global South must work on changing those conditions as a part of peace-building and mental health interventions. Without framing mental health and without framing our investments in our communities, we will just have more leaking water. Thus, the purpose of my research is to challenge the three mainstream approaches that I just talked about, not only for practitioners, but also for donors and by academics, by these three pieces of the purpose of my research. The first is to understand better the impact of chronic violence to peace, justice, and development. The second is to develop policy recommendations for recovery, which include peace building and stabilization and economic growth. The third is to finally document the healing-centered peace-building approach from existing practice in order to define and give the practice a name. As a peace-building practitioner of 25 years, I have seen when healing-centered approach is used, many other initiatives work better, including dialogue work, violence prevention, good development initiatives, and also good governance. Now take a look at my cup. What do you see? My cup is repaired. It's not perfect, but now when I pour water, I can use it for what I wish. I can take a sip, I can share it with my neighbors, water my garden. I can even take a bath. With healing comes the ability to see choice. I believe this is similar to when a community begins to own their own healing process. It gives them new choices, that when everything was controlled by the outside was just leaking. But when the cracks are healed, our leaking stops. For the time remaining, I will give a short overview of my literature review, highlight the grounded theory methodology I use for my research, give a short overview of my findings, and feature 4 of the innovations that use the Healing Center peace-building approach, and then I'll conclude with some recommendations that came from my research. As I started my research, I investigated the history of trauma and how it's understood in the literature. This in-depth look at the history of trauma, which I don't have time to go into today, gave me a multidisciplinary view of the subject. The concept of trauma has continued to sit on the fringe of both psychiatry and psychology. In part, trauma work is on the fringe because it's so complex. It's complicated to diagnose, treat, and impacts everyone differently. The biomedical model advances mental disorders, which are brain diseases, and due to chemical imbalances. It emphasizes treatment by pharmaceutical drugs and is the mainstream way of understanding mental health. Because trauma impacts everyone differently, the medical model of diagnosis and treatment is limited and is not evidence-based. Early in my studies, I started the process to frame my practice of the last 25 years with a systems map. In today's presentation, I'll use my systems map to give a short overview of the 3 mainstream responses to the problems I had laid out in the introduction, which is how peace builders and others can begin to start to sort out individuals, communities, and organizations in chronic violence environments. Trauma and pain inflict not only individuals, it becomes mainstream. When they become widespread and ongoing, they affect the entire community, even the country as a whole. The implications for this are serious. The resilience of the country's social fabric, the success of development schemes, and even the hope of generations are all lost. In the late 1990s, Martha Carrera and her team traveled to the worst violence-affected regions of Nicaragua with the hope of understanding their psychological health post-conflict and post-Hurricane Mitch. What the team discovered was surprising, and I quote, "They found high levels of apathy, isolation, aggressiveness, abuse, chronic somatic illnesses, low levels of flexibility, tolerance, and the inability to trust and work." Nicaragua was a multiply wounded, multiply traumatized, multiply mourning country. And as Cabra said, it's hard to move forward and build democracy when personal and communal history still hurts. So the main approaches that we have in our kind of toolbox is the mental health approach is the first one. And it's the approach used by specialized mental health NGOs, governments, the World Health Organization. Overall, there's a lack of funding, national capacity, and limited infrastructure for programs in the Global South. Western-style mental health services are visible primarily during humanitarian intervention period and usually scale down in the post-conflict stage when the initial post-conflict boom ends and the funding for such support wanes. The most common approach is actually the psychosocial support approach. This approach is used also by the UN, NGOs, and others primarily during the humanitarian phase and immediately after conflict. It's regulated by established norms and frameworks such as the Interagency Standing Committee's guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings. But similar to mental health approach, the psychosocial approach interventions are usually not sustainable after the emergency funding ends. Often in the post-conflict period when the focus transitions to reconciliation, institutional building, governance, psychosocial programs finish. The approach fails to make the link between psychosocial support and the larger stabilization interventions needed to support larger recovery. The final approach, which is a non-approach, it is the ignore it approach. Includes people working in environments and conflicts emerging from conflict or still in conflict, and includes donors, United Nations, other multilaterals, international and national civil society, host governments, and security actors like national and international military and the police. The lack of engagement with these issues shows that there is no major international donor, UN agency, or national government that has a clear set of guidelines for obtaining the financial resources for establishing and sustaining culturally effective social healing activities for those who are violence affected. Even though we know up to 80% of conflict-affected populations may be affected by mental and psychosocial disorders. This is another look at the three approaches with the chronic violence in the middle. I'm now going to move to give a very, very short overview about the methodology that I use for this study. But again, given the limited time, this will be just a very short overview. The study used grounded theory as the primary study. Grounded theory was valid, yet flexible methodology developed to support the development of models grounded in real and observable data. It was appropriate methodology for developing a theory around the Healing Center peace building because the practice already existed, and grounded theory assisted me to document the approach from practitioners around the world. My sample size was 30 peace building and trauma-informed practitioners, scholars, and donors, and leaders in the field, all working in different environments, different contexts, and different fields around the world. I focused on practitioners in Africa and Asia, but did reach out to more global leaders in the field. I finished my interviews and asked those I'd interviewed if someone else they knew would be also useful to talk about this subject. While some of the interviews were in person, others pre-COVID were facilitated by Zoom. The data collection was interesting. My first 3 interviews were held in the same week in 2 separate locations. The selection of the initial participants was based on the fact that I had 2 global events in early 2018 in Kenya and Sierra Leone where long-term peace-building practitioners had gathered and where 3 practitioners with decades of experience of working in trauma and traumatized populations agreed to be interviewed. Following the guidelines of theoretical sampling, each participant was asked to recommend a number of people who could possibly fulfill the expected needs for theoretical sampling. The first 3 interviews went from 120 to 150 minutes each, while all 3 provided rich information about the context they worked in and the experience they were having in trauma and peace building. The data was of such high quality for these first 3 that almost all of them, of the data was used in the research. As the interviews went on, the subsequent interviews became progressively shorter as the study progressed, with the final interviews going for just about 1 hour each, which is normal with grounded theory, as I'd reached saturation. The data analysis. The grounded theory is an alliterative process whereby researchers move between data collection and analysts writing memos, coding, and creating models and theory building. I began this method by writing detailed notes after each interview, pulling out the key points for each interview, and starting the memo writing process. Because of my extremely busy schedule in 2018 and 2019, interviews were undertaken, but I was only able to transcribe each interview starting in mid-2019. Because of the time lapse from the data collection to the transcription, I used the line-by-line coding process in order to deeply interact with the data as the main findings were being finalized. Thus, changes to the system map is where I first started doing my data analysis, because I memoed after each interview and I started to adapt my system map. During the course of the interviews with the participants, I continued to revise my research questions due to the new concepts, such as the theory of chronic violence, which was developed through the data. Other changes after the first 3 interviews and the initial analysis of the data included the first changes of the interview questions. Changes in the interview questions happened 4 times during the interview process. With that, I'd like us to actually move to the most exciting part of the thesis, which is actually the discussion and the findings. Healing-centered peace-building approach addresses the complexity of chronic violence. It acknowledges that systems and structures which should be supportive of recovery are often damaged and broken by the same chronic violence. The 3 mainstream approaches that I highlighted earlier do not sufficiently address the effects and the impacts of chronic violence. Thus, a new framework was necessary. Practitioners claim an alternative approach existed in practice but was nameless, and existing interventions were primarily associated with psychosocial approaches. The healing-centered approach addressed trauma fueled by cycles of violence and comprised key elements of the practice-based approach, such as inclusion, customization and contextualization, breaking the cycles of violence, systems thinking, and trauma-informed tools. I'm now going to spend the next few minutes actually going more in depth and in detail of these findings. The inclusion component of the healing-centered peace-building has 3 subcomponents. I'll highlight some of what I learned in my research about the inclusion component and its 3 subcomponents. Peace builder practitioners work in chronic violence environments, where nothing seems to work because of the complexity of the situation. Inclusion is usually the first casualty. As noted by an interviewee, and I quote, "The language which comes with violence is language of exclusion, of distortion, of belittling, of destroying self-esteem, and has incredibly long legacy and is linked to psychological trauma." End quote. The first subcomponent is that a multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approach is important. Rarely are psychologists or even counselors present, and even if they are, it's unlikely that they speak local languages. Communities may also be suspicious of outsiders. One of the strengths of the healing-centered approach is the multidisciplinary and sectoral nature, which includes a wide range of stakeholders, including, but not limited to, peace builders, community development workers, community health workers, teachers, psychologists, artists, teachers, police officers, even academics, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, volunteers, researchers. All these people that I'm talking about are people with lived experience. A South African practitioner noted that since there were, and I quote, "not enough professional counselors, we have learned that we can all hold space in order to start the healing process," end of quote. Moreover, one of the psychologist peace builders noted that for her, she learned early on, and I quote, "we psychologists needed to address much more than just the so-called actual mental health," end of quote. The second component for the role is for the role of lived experiences. In the healing-centered approach, lived experiences is important and a welcomed aspect. The underlying divergence between expertise and lived experience appears in a common occurrence in low resource and conflict-prone communities across the world. A psychologist peace builder from Kenya told me, "The biomedical approach is a narrow approach. It focuses on mental health expertise only. It does not address justice, development, or peace. You need people with lived experiences to bring that to the table," end of quote. Often lived experience is only long-term support available at the community level. One community activist in the US told me how in his neighborhood, which is at high poverty levels and is primarily African American, continues to, as I quote, "little access, but there continues to be great distrust of mental health professionals," end of quote. The last subcomponent of inclusion is local and traditional healers are included. The predominantly Western biomedical approach to mental health is based on professional expertise, which is often meant to replace local healers in their more traditional roles. From interviews, it became clear that engaging with local cultures and their approaches to healing, building on existing resilience factors, and strengthening relationships is at the core of individual and collective healing. One interviewee from Kenya shared a story about how she found there to be a Mama Anisa in every community. The Mama Anisa is the person everyone calls when the community or the family is in crisis. As mentioned, there are not enough trained counselors and social workers in these communities to help people deal with high levels of distress. The healing-centered peace-building approach works to identify and support hundreds of grassroots healers, such as the Mama Anisas on the Kenyan coast. Mama Anisas are accessible and stay in the community long-term. The second component is customization and contextualization. It has 4 subcomponents, which I'll explain in more detail from my research. Culture adapts and changes and is not static. Johann Galton's theory of violence shows how beliefs, attitudes, and symbols are used to enhance hatred, mistrust, and fear of the other because of deep cultural practices, which are often not even spoken about. However, cultural influences for healing and peace are as powerful when combined with healing-centered approach and have great impact on social transformation processes. The first subcomponent of the customization and contextualization component focuses on community-informed and culturally adapted processes. In healing-centered approach, interventions are adapted and relevant in the local context. Many of the interviewees note that the majority of mental health and psychosocial programs are culturally inappropriate, expensive, rely on outside expertise, and were not scalable. For this reason, peace builders could not engage with such programs. An interviewee from Zimbabwe noted cultural and context was center for her healing-centered work, as it took the work beyond, and I quote, just another NGO's intervention, end quote. Another noted that because we need this, it cannot be developed by anyone but us. A second component is the importance of storytelling. Rituals and stories encourage resilience through the development of meaning making. When conflict occurs, stories are shared from one generation to another. Often mistrust and division and hate are transferred along with a toxic story. When healing has taken place, stories transmit peace and trust between generations as well. In the healing-centered approach, stories have the quality of bringing people together and cementing good relations between neighbors. It's been said, you can't hate people once you've heard their stories. Often these stories are not time-barred and become a critical part of the community's identity. One interviewee observed, some of you will listen when people are talking. You think they mean last week. You'll think they're recounting something they were there for, but they weren't present. It came down through their grandparents or great-grandparents as if it was last week. It's very much alive. The third subcomponent focuses on using a decolonializing approach. A key trait of colonialism is that it devalued indigenous people, their knowledge, and their cultures, while healing-centered approach is intentional about integrating and utilizing indigenous healing practices. Peace-building activities are often targeted at post-colonial societies, where structural injustices, conflict, and violence are underlying root causes that causes to active and latent conflict. A Kenyan peace builder explained to me, colonialism is not just a political colonialization. It was also psychological colonialization. It was degradation and dehumanization of those who had less power by the colonizer. So all generations of our forefathers lived under colonialization. And when we got independence, we got political independence, but we did not get psychological independence, end of quote. The peace builders as peace builders, we're trained to develop projects and programs and implement community level things, but rarely do we focus on the unraveling of the tragic after effects of colonialization. My last subcategory of this component is utilizing community resources sustainably. Hopelessness and helplessness are common feelings and expressed by communities in chronic violence. Tapping into existing community assets and helping strengthen existing resources is a critical component of healing-centered peacebuilding process. One interviewee from Zimbabwe noted, "The idea of building on the local resources for me is really an important one." It was also noted that when people lead their own healing processes, two things happen. One is that people increase their agency, as the peace builder from Zimbabwe said, empowered people ask questions and make challenges. And secondly, the healing process is organic and healing, as in the words of a Kenyan peace builder, it becomes culturally adaptive through language and culture. My third category, the component of healing-centered, of breaking the cycles of violence. Trauma which is not transformed is transferred. People who have been hurt can at times justify the use of violence by seeking justice. One interviewee has been involved in healing-centered peacebuilding for the last 25 years. She noted, and I quote, "The cycles of violence, it's a key component of combining mental health, the trauma experience, and what happens within the peacebuilding field," end of quote. The first component focuses on how engaging both victims and perpetrators in the healing-centered work. The healing-centered peacebuilding approach acknowledges there's often not a clear distinction between victim and aggressor, and everyone affected by trauma should be able to access a support system in order to break the cycle of violence. Stress, and in particular trauma, often lead victims to think negatively of themselves as well as others, which in turn affects their relationships with others. One interviewee from the US noted that when she listens to hate radio, it's just spewing victimhood, and yet those broadcasting are often considered the aggressors. With both mental health and psychosocial approaches focusing primarily on the victim, the approaches leave those who hurt others isolated and prone to continuing cycles of violence. One interviewee from Kenya put it, "The perpetrator does not see the victim as someone who's going through pain and hurt. He only feels his own pain." The second subcomponent focuses on the development of agency. The impact of trauma and chronic violence causes people to feel powerless, hopeless, without agency. Agency from a healing process assists in unlocking innovation and creativity to address the challenges of one's life and those of the community. It also helps in changing outlooks associated with a depressed mindset, often focused on obstruction and boundaries to achieving personal and community objectives. A Kenyan peace builder noted why investing in a healing process became so important to him. He shared how during the 2007 and 8 conflict, we found peace builders in Kenya had given up. The level of trauma and burnout was too much. Attitudes focusing on hopelessness and powerlessness are characteristics of depression and stop people from engaging with finding solutions to their problems. Healing brings hope, and with it, the possibility of new solutions. The fourth component is systems thinking. Several of the interviewees explained how systems thinking was critical to providing a systems orientation to understanding the patterns within the healing system peacebuilding approach. Systems thinking views all experiences as interrelated. People are not isolated and are connected to their context and their environment. The first subcomponent is resilient informed. Resilience is that quality that allows people to be knocked down and come back stronger. Resilience is not a trait that people have or don't have. It involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed. One interviewee shared, "Resilience can be built upon, and we're not slaves to our past. We are free to create a new future, as long as we're able to frame the conversation of trauma in relation to resilience. It's an extremely powerful way to approach healing conversations. The second component is a foundation for development, justice, and governance interventions. Chronic violence and adversity impact global well-being, our behavior towards each other, our ability for our kids to learn, communities to develop, and even the global economy to thrive. Healing-centered peace building is a foundation for improving the outcomes of development, justice, and governance interventions. Do you remember my cracked cup from the beginning of the presentation? Trauma that negatively impacts on people's ability to constructively participate in peace and development are like the cracked cup. In an interview from Kenya, an interviewee from Kenya noted that her work with healing-centered approach had given her a new understanding, a holistic understanding about how healing and how it's connected to almost all realms of life. Our education system functions, she said, within certain disciplines, so people don't see the connection between the need for healing and our politics, the need of healing and our economy, the need of healing and connection to many other subjects. The third component includes collective healing approaches. During the Global Collective Trauma Summit in October 2019, Dr. Bethel noted, and I quote, "We're a society organized based on trauma. So we need to go from being trauma organized to being trauma informed and then eventually healing centered." One psychologist I interviewed who's become a peace builder later in his career and is a strong proponent of peer support groups noted, "Group work has the potential to impact justice." While another interviewee said space is critical. It's needed in those places where people can collectively make choices to change. The last component promotes ecological healing. Natural disasters and climate change have damaging effects on mental and social health, as well as on peace and security. On surface, many people are impacted by harsh and intense environmental events. Climate change impacts have mental health consequences and impact security and peace. One interviewee noted, "We're living on a fragile planet, but we don't have much of a concept of a global community." At the beginning of the interview, the same interviewee said, "Indigenous cultures knew that we were also ecological beings, not just social beings." And my last component, the final healing-centered component is trauma-informed tools. Being trauma-informed uses a lens which allows everyone to begin to understand trauma, its impact on both individuals and communities. As one interviewee from South Africa said, "A trauma-informed support system is holistic." Another noted how structural and direct violence provides the reason for developing trauma-informed workplaces, schools, community networks, and resilience-based programs. The first component looks at the importance of relationships which hold and transform space for others. Ryan North noted, "Our brains are wired for connection, but trauma rewires them for protection. That's why healthy relationships are difficult for wounded people." In an interview from Kenya, an interviewee from Kenya noted, "Safe spaces and safe relationships are needed for healing. Trauma isolates people. When that trust is broken, relationships are also broken. People who experience trauma need a system of support to help them heal." One group trainee explained why group processes are also so important when she said, "I think there's something important to look at in terms of laughing or crying with people as opposed to being alone. Because I think when you're crying on your own, sometimes in an ongoing way, it's actually not doing the healing job it needs to. There's something about crying with somebody else that is healing." The second component is the neuroscience concepts ground practice. In the past decade, advancements in neuroscience have brought new understanding into the peace-building field. For people in communities with trauma reactions, the fear response happens whether danger is real or whether we just believe danger is there when actually there's none. One interviewee emphasized, "Trust is biological, not only emotional." Another posed the question, "Well, we want people to be in the green and the regulated zone of social engagement. But what happens if they're not there? How do we build peace in such a situation? The third component is the embodied practice to regulate the nervous system. Several interviewees talked about the link between the body and the brain. One interviewee asked, how does trauma impact the body? A social activist and trauma healer in the US noted, unprocessed trauma means part of us are numb. The parts of us that we would know are not to do with the parts of us that are able to have more complicated solutions. We don't have access to it personally or collectively. As the saying goes, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. You just have to be present, kind, and listen. Listening is an opportunity for co-regulation, which regulates our nervous system. If we feel distressed, having someone just listen or hold space for us calms our nervous system. The final component is an arts-based interventions open creativity and innovation. The approach inspires new creativity and innovation, creating different types of art such as music, sound, dance, movement, improvisation, storytelling, play, and imagination helps develop a sense of emotional safety and well-being, both which are essential when trying to stabilize our brains and our nervous system. Expression through the arts supports the creation of safety and the ability to separate oneself from the horrifying experiences of trauma without relying on words, which are often ineffective. One of the interviewees said he realized when using theater, it was much better to use unembodied work at the community level. So when you do a skit or a drama about a family or gender-based violence, you'd find people were more apt to discuss these things openly than if you were just doing a focus group discussion. This brings me to a close of my short overview of the healing-centered peace-building approach that came from my research. I would now like to talk about the innovations that I'm going to highlight. They were developed from practices taking place across the globe, both at the grassroots, but also at the policy level. Each of these 4 examples was selected because they were mentioned in the interviews with the interviewees, and upon further reflection and research, they fit into the peace-building, the healing-centered peace-building approach that we've just gone through with the 5 elements. Let me go quickly through the 5. The first is the strategies for trauma awareness and resilience, which began after the national collective trauma in the US of 9/11. Initially, the goal was to develop a program to help first responders become more aware of the psychological trauma of the people they worked with, as well as themselves. But the framework then now evolved into more of a peace-building framework, putting individual, community, and societal well-being at the center, linking trauma awareness and resilience, restorative justice, meaning-making, conflict transformation, and building secure and sustainable communities. Today, the program has worked with thousands of people in over 75 countries in the world. STAR is the grandmother of the healing-centered approach. The next approach is very close to my heart. It's the Green String Network, where we contribute to breaking cycles of violence through the systems approach, drawing from cultural resources. Our work is focused on addressing trauma as one of the root causes of violent behavior. The healing-centered stories on the website honor the human journey from pain to creative empowerment, limitation to inspired new possibilities, and fear to compassion. Nazakawaz in Nepal was established in 2001 to address the issues of the war in Nepal. Its focus was on work with women and youth impacted by the civil war, where they lost 17,000 people killed in 10 years of civil war. There was a lot of cultural and social change brought about because of the violence. They implemented without naming a form of the healing-centered peacebuilding by providing cultural healing opportunities for women and youth for the last 19 years. Early on, Nazakawa's leadership realized that the organization needed to open their doors and their hearts to providing a safe space for social healing. Now, this is my last one. This is the Building Community Resilience in the US at the policy level. It's a model that's being implemented nationally in 5 locations across the US. The example's a bit distinctive from the other 3 examples because it's actually a scaling up, targeting both advocacy and policy level examples of the healing-centered peacebuilding approach. The collaboration is led by George Washington University, and the national-wide network seeks to improve the health of children, families, and communities by fostering engagement between grassroots community services and public and private systems to provide a protective buffer against adverse childhood experiences occurring in adverse community environments. While it's aligned to the 5 elements of the healing-centered peacebuilding, it's also a progression and shows what a scaling of the approach can look like when used at both a networking and a policy level. This brings me to the very end when we talk about the conclusion and the discussions of the findings. Today, trauma is a buzzword within the peacebuilding field, while at the same time it's becoming recognized as a critical element of the field. Many of the interviewees told me during their work, they began to question, why do we continue to do business as usual when we can tell things aren't working? The best planned projects on paper just don't work when implementation starts. And they noted it's because there was no inbuilt method for participants to deal with their painful past. They find wounded leaders that are ineffective, structural inequalities, and conflicts that are rarely and substantially addressed. How do peace builders support holistic and inclusive processes if social healing is not a foundational element of our work? While some progress has been made to combine peace building with mental health and psychosocial support, it's clear that the mainstream approaches have not fully integrated the fields effectively. The 2 fields have integrated only in a piecemeal way, sometimes appending or inserting useful elements from each other's discipline at 1 or maybe 2 specific parts of a project, rather than an integration throughout. The research examined the 3 major responses that we've already gone through. These approaches were shown not to address the effects and the impacts of chronic violence, thus the new framework was necessary. The healing-centered approach of the new framework of the complexity of chronic violence. It recognizes the systems and structures which should be supportive of recovery are often greatly damaged by the same violence and are often broken. Healing-centered peacebuilding refers to ways in which leaders, organizations mitigate the impact of violence, bringing trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into their organizational culture, practices, and policies. Oops, let me just see. I'll give you one more view of the systems map before I go into my policy recommendations. As we've seen earlier in the presentation, the healing-centered approach is more than just awareness. It also brings behavioral change, which supports social transformation and change from a violent society to one that values peace. A healing-centered approach requires important variations in how government policies are designed, how communities deal with the past, and plan for the future. Peacebuilding as a field must also change and adapt. My first policy recommendation, oops, let me not go so far, is that localization must become authentic and not only on paper. Donors continue to fund and enable mostly international agencies, yet these bodies are not directly accountable to the people in violence-prone communities, only their donors, who are very removed from the insecurity the communities face. New relationships between donors, international agencies, and local peace builders need to be revised. Creating relationships with healthier power dynamics is critical. I formulated 3 recommendations to begin to assure that localization is authentic. First, reframe the strength-based approach, support communities to own their own healing agendas, and design interventions with healing-centered foundation. The second recommendation is to support community-driven healing approaches. Embracing our inner well-being is something individuals can invest in, but more than ever, societies must play a pivotal role in supporting people's well-being journey by creating an environment which promotes kindness, connection, vulnerability, and community. If the individual thrives, the whole community will thrive. There are 2 recommendations that help support this recommendation. Move away from the biomedical models of mental health and psychosocial, and invest in the adaptation of context and culture. What works in Kenya may not work the same as in Nepal. The last series of recommendations are cross-cutting programmatic recommendations. As stated earlier, interventions to prevent violence must be relevant in the local context. A defining strength of healing-centered peacebuilding is the level of community ownership of healing and transformation. However, because the healing-centered peacebuilding approach was developed through practice, there were 3 key program recommendations which were critical for the approach, which can help practitioners enhance their practice in the coming years. The first is integrating the multidisciplinary, multisectoral teams, prioritizing evidence-based research, and uniting with those working in the environmental issues. Since we're in a university and we are all looking at teaching and bringing forward the next generation of peace builders, I've also got a few teaching and training recommendations. The first is that we have to talk about social healing and peace building as a foundation for all other skills that are built. Secondly, we need to prepare students to face trauma in the work they start to do, helping them develop embodied practices while studying so they can tap into them later when they need them. And lastly, let's help students understand that if they're going into this field and they're going to work into the organizations that are there, they will encounter organizations that have been impacted by trauma. Helping them understand how to work in and lead healing-centered organizations will go a long ways to supporting them in the field, but I also think transform our field. So, my last slide, and in closing today, I'd like to say trauma is an individual matter, but it's also a social and community issue. It impacts perspectives of peace and justice, limits development, the ability to govern effectively, and even the quality of life within communities. It bewilders the meaning of universal experience, things like love, hate, happiness, and justice. It impacts how we see ourselves, each other, and even how we shape our identity. It's with great hope that peace builders and others working in chronic violence environments will begin to understand the impact of trauma, that these are not mental illnesses, but normal responses to violence, abuse, inequality, and marginalization. Today, doing nothing is no longer an answer, because if the symptoms are left unaddressed, the symptoms will not only become mental illness, but will negatively impact the larger society. In order to do something about trauma, systems and organizations must change. It's no longer an option to ignore the issues and not to act. We need to heal our cracks before we can move forward, and healing is possible. I'm done. I won't make that face. Man.
You need to finish by taking a sip. You need to just...
Okay, I need to take a sip. That's a good one.
Then you're like, thank you.
Thank you.
From your mended cup.
Here, let me go out so we can stop the recording, and then you can give me